Warning: the following stories contain references to domestic violence, murder, and child-related trauma. If that's difficult for you, please take care of yourself before listening. Christmas is supposed to be safe. Twinkling lights, bad sweaters, too much eggnog, the kind of stuff that makes you feel cozy even when you shouldn't. These next 4 stories are the opposite. They're Christmases where ordinary decorations became a backdrop for something that broke the season's spell. 4 real feeling moments where holiday cheer was ripped away, and what was left was fear, grief, or an odd, stubborn kind of courage. I tell them not to scare you for the sake of it, but because the holidays make us trust the world a little more than we should sometimes, and when that trust fractures, it shatters loud. We'll start with a party meant to heal, then a grotto, a gun, and a woman who decided she wasn't letting anyone hurt the kids on her watch. After that, a childhood memory that wasn't what it seemed. And finally, a neighborhood gift that turned into something sinister. That's the map. First stop, the party that should have been safe. Story 1. The party that should have been safe. Trigger warning. This story includes domestic abuse and the aftermath of assault. We'd planned the party for weeks. Not the kind of let's get dressed up and take photos party, but the kind you throw to patch a person back together, even if only for a night. Jane had come out of a marriage that left her small in ways we could see. She was working 2 jobs, sleeping like it would never be safe, smiling sometimes as if she'd forgotten the shape of her own voice. She needed a night where no one talked about court dates or restraining orders, and especially no one said his name. So we made a rule before anyone arrived. No Nick. Nobody mentioned him. No scrolling news on phones. No sudden silences that could balloon into something worse. We strung up cheap white lights that buzzed a little, put a plastic wreath on the front door, and pushed the couch into a circuit so people could move without bumping into each other. Someone brought Mariah Carey on a loop, and it somehow worked. All I Want for Christmas Is You as background armor. It felt ridiculous. It felt necessary. Somewhere between a toasted joke and a plate of cookies, Jane went quiet. She was looking toward the back door like someone hoping for a miracle. "What is it?" I asked. Her eyes were wet, but not from the wine.
"He's outside," she said, soft, as if saying it too loud might make it true. At first we blamed panic. PTSD does that. Memory gets tangled with the present, smell triggers the old emergency, the brain throws up smoke to hide the wound. People said that aloud. Steph, who'd organized the party like a military operation, pushed off a chair and went to check the porch with the kind of practical calm you either have or you don't. She cracked the door. There was a shape in the dim porch light, a head bowed against the cold like someone trying to balance on a metaphor. For a second he was just a silhouette. Then the streetlight hit him and you could see him properly. A man in a stained coat, graying beard, and something about the way he stood that made the air go thin. We knew he was supposed to be in prison. "Steph." Jane's voice was a twig about to snap. "Is it—" She didn't finish. Steph opened the door wider. Nick stepped forward like he expected to be welcomed. He smelled of wet wool and stale tobacco. It's a stupid detail to remember, but I can still smell it now when I try. It's how memory clamps down on a moment we don't want. "Jane?" he called, casual as a neighbor checking on a package. That's the part where being an adult and being frightened look the same. My friend Ryan moved first. He had a cricket bat leaning against a staircase because someone thought it would be funny to bring it as a prop, and now it was the most serious thing in the room. He grabbed it like a parent grabs a hand. Others clung to the banister, to one another, to the idea that this is wrong and must be made right. Nick shoved past the door. Doors are supposed to be boundaries. They are not invulnerable. He came inside with an arrogance that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with entitlement, the old, ugly kind. He demanded Jane. He used words meant to cut. We threw things. Someone, no one wants to admit it, full stop, threw a lamp. Things landed on him, things meant to distract, to bind, to make him stop reaching. Ryan swung the bat. I remember the sound, a hollow thud that seemed to make everyone inhale at once. He staggered. There was a hard, bright animal sound in the room. Someone screamed, and no one could tell whether it came from fear or relief. Nick still lunged forward. You can't imagine the stubbornness of a person who believes something is owed to them. It's like watching someone try to punch their way into forgiveness. Sirens came much later than they should have, but they did come. That's part of the story. Somebody had called. Someone else had held on to the idea that the police would solve this, that the institutions would hold where people had not. Nick stumbled outside amidst discarded wrapping paper and toppled chairs, tripped across the welcome mat, and vanished into the night like a bad punctuation mark. We closed the door on the sound of him breathing against the porch boards. The police were polite but efficient.
We told them what we could. They asked the right questions. Who hit him? What did he say? Did we call 911 in time? Did we get a registration number? Did we know he might be out? Some of the questions we couldn't answer, because in panic you forget how to hold the narrative together. Jane was small in the middle of that kitchen, shaking like a leaf, and we wrapped her in coats and oversized scarves like a patch job. Later, in the fluorescent calm of a precinct office, the truth that undercut the panic was explained in bureaucratic terms. A clerical error in the prison records had allowed for a temporary release that should not have happened. The boxy words made the horror smell like paper. He had been let out without the supervision that was required. We were told he was recaptured days later. The records would show a date. The officers would check off boxes. Nick would face whatever process follows such a mistake. But processes are slow, our DNA told us, and in the meantime, consequences lived in people's bodies. What matters in a story like this is not only that the paperwork failed, but that the failure mattered the most on Christmas Eve. The holidays are when family or friends lean nearest to each other. They are when someone like Nick expects forgiveness to be easier, when he might see people's guard as lower. That's not to say he had a right to anything. He had none. But the timing was cruel and felt intentional by proximity. Jane did not immediately recover. That is its own sentence. The group that had arranged the party became a kind of guard. We installed small rituals. Someone would text her at night, someone else would walk her to her car. Rides were arranged like a discreet watch. We joked sometimes about forming a neighborhood militia, and the jokes fell flat, because they were glimpses of a very real need. There were things we couldn't fix. She kept waking up at 2 in the morning, convinced a shadow at the window was him. She flinched when a hand reached for a doorknob. She started leaving lights on in rooms she'd never used before. Small habits cemented into armor. The party had done what it could, given her an hour that wasn't full of fear, but it couldn't stitch the deeper things. And there was the odd moral residue of that night. Whoever hit Nick hard enough to make him stagger, did they commit an offense? Did they choose correctly? People argued about that. We didn't have to decide a single moral absolute. We only had to get Jane safe. That decision hovered over us like cigarette smoke. Months later, when the legal ink dried in whatever way it did, the story's edges didn't soften. Nick was recaptured for the clerical error, and yes, paperwork followed him back to a cell. The record would tell you he was released on license some years after. The facts in the document do not line up with how living memory carries the night. Jane moved after a while.
She needed to not be in a kitchen that smelled like the song that had played when he walked in. Some of us stayed in that city, some left. There's a kind of sorrow unique to this story, because it involves a failure of institutions and a survival performed by friends. It's not heroic in a cinematic way. There were no white hats, no dramatic speeches, no neat paragraphs of justice. There was a small group of people who put themselves between a person and a threat, and then held each other afterward. There was also a clerical error that tourists in the system, people behind desks, didn't catch. The holidays amplify both the tenderness and the error.
Kids came with parents, with candy canes, with the sticky air of excitement. On the morning she decided to stop in, the grandmother was balancing a pie in one hand and a casserole in the other. She liked to feed people. It was how she measured compassion. When she walked into the grotto to check on the volunteers, people exhausted from working long shifts, wrapping toys by lamplight, she noticed something off. The man playing Santa had eyes that didn't match. One iris was dark and steady. The other looked like a coin dropped into water. Heterochromia is a small, unusual detail. It's harmless, mostly, but it caught her attention the way a loose stitch might snag a sweater. She joked about it with the other volunteers at first. They laughed it off. But she had a nagging sense that something wasn't right, a prick behind the eyes like intuition that runs on old cliches. She left to run another errand, thinking the thought would slide away if she put more food in the oven, more chores on the list. Half an hour later, the radio in her kitchen cracked with a bulletin. Reports came through about 2 men who had robbed a bank in a nearby town and were considered armed and dangerous. One of them matched the heterochromia description. They'd left in a beat-up car and were believed to be on the move. New details would come and go as the announcer cleared his throat. This was 1961. Information moved with less speed than it does now, but wherever the radio said to look, people looked. The grandmother did not call the sheriff. She did not stand by the phone and wait for instructions. She wrapped the casserole in a dish towel, shoved the keys into her pocket, and drove like someone with a simple, urgent plan. The roads were thin, the night edge still holding on, and she hit the gas as if speed could muscle away the fear. When she pulled up to the grotto, kids were still in a state of candy and wonder. The Santa man was talking to a small boy and chuckling in an easy way that people who put on costumes cultivate. The grandmother walked up the rickety steps and looked at him. He smiled at her like a practiced performer. "Excuse me," she said. "Mind if I take a look at that beard?" He laughed the laugh of a man who thinks he's harmless. 2 other men stood back near the feed store, hands in their pockets. They looked like they were waiting to be let in on a joke. She moved like someone who'd decided not to be fooled. Her voice didn't carry drama. It carried consequence. She grabbed the collar of the Santa suit and pulled. The beard came away like a mask. It fell to the floor and the man's face was ordinary, more dangerous for it. The other 2 started to move then, the kind of movement that meant plans will be tried and may have to be abandoned. The grandmother reached for something at her waist. That's where I have to slow down, because it's getting to the part where the world snaps in a very sharp way.
The image is absurd and terrible all at once. A woman who'd spent her life doing ordinary things, reaching for a tool usually reserved for a show of violence. In a town like that, people kept licensed guns in drawers for protection. She had one. She pulled it as if it belonged in a drawer, but suddenly needed to be in someone's hand. The radio in her car was still humming with lines of static and an announcer giving an address that might match. She stood between the Santa man and the children. For a moment, do people remember that kind of thin silence? The town held its breath. The men she'd unmasked glanced at each other. Maybe they hadn't expected resistance from someone like her. Maybe they had misjudged the place. Sirens were not instant. Radio operators were not omnipotent. The grandmother held the man with heterochromia with a steady eye and a voice that sounded like winter. She did what she could with what she had. She kept the children away, kept the line between harm and safety braided together by a single improbable human decision. I'll stop there for a beat, because that's the hinge. It's the moment a small-town radio bulletin runs straight into a woman's habit of caring. It's the moment where a costume becomes a lie, and a pie becomes a weapon of moral clarity. We can imagine the deputies pulling up, badges flashing, the men in cuffs, the town pledging to buy the grandmother a new coat as thanks. That's the natural arc of this tale. But this isn't a neat story. It's a weathered one. There are questions about bravery and how we remember it, about how small towns tell legends back into existence. There are also things I won't invent, I won't claim a tidy court case or a hero's parade. I will say she became a story people told at church suppers, the woman who chased the danger away from the grotto. I will say she never bragged about it. She put the gun back in the drawer and went on with her chores, like chores were a kind of prayer. But that's the end of the part of the story I'd have you see for now. A woman who refused to be a background prop in someone else's plan. She stepped into danger in a cardigan and came back into her kitchen like nothing had happened. The town baked a pie and told the children a sanitized version that kept eyes from widening and hearts from learning too soon how dark some people could be. They needed to keep the miracle intact, even if the miracle looked a lot like a woman with an old revolver. We're going to leave the grotto for now and keep the lights on a little longer. There's one more thing I want you to think about before we move on. Heroism isn't always a headline. Sometimes it's a casserole in a dish towel and a small, decisive step that prevents the worst from happening. Sometimes it's a woman who has spent her life making sure others have supper, and on one night decides supper isn't worth if the children aren't safe.
That kind of ordinary courage sits quietly beside other, less comfortable truths. Hold on to that, because the next story is about the exact opposite of protective lies. It's a childhood memory that becomes a different kind of horror once the world shappens around it. Trigger warning for this next part. This story involves a child's encounter with violent crime and the long shadow it casts. If that's hard for you, please take care of yourself. Story 3. The Santa on the Fire Escape. When you're small, you believe in certain things, the way you believe in gravity, without asking. Santa lives somewhere just beyond the attic, or in a store, or inside your parents' pockets. Santa arrives at night. Santa brings gifts. The rules are simple and sacred. I was 4 the winter I saw Santa on the fire escape. We lived in an old brick building that smelled like old coats and a soft grease of takeout. The radiator hissed like a sleepy animal, and the hallway lights buzzed even when they were turned off. My father worked long hours. My mother tried to make holidays feel like something you could hold in both hands. That year she bought novelty paper with cartoon snowmen and a cheap squeaky red nose that somehow made everyone laugh when she put it on and tried to sing carols. I remember the night more like a cinematic burn than an ordinary memory. The living room was lit in a soft, fierce way by the Christmas tree. There were too many packages and the tape had been cut in ragged lines. My little brother dozed on the couch with a half-unwrapped candy cane pressed to his tongue. My parents kept whispering. Whispering grows strange sounds when you're small. It implies plans and secrets, and the idea of things you are not allowed to know. That evening, my mother told the usual tales. The man in red, the reindeer, the way good kids get rewarded. She tucked blankets around my brother and kissed him on the forehead, and left the wrapper of our family's version of magic in place. Then she washed her hands and sat at the kitchen table to fold napkins and hum a hymn in a way that sounded like protection. Later, when the house quieted and the hum of traffic outside softened, I woke with a peculiar certainty. I padded to the window, the glass cold under my forehead. The fire escape outside jutted like a metal ladder from the second-floor window of the apartment above ours, a black lattice against a sky that seemed glycerin smooth with winter. I saw, perched on that little ledge as if it were a stage, a figure in red. He sat very still, one knee drawn up, toes dangling, a sag at his side. The porch light made a halo around him. He seemed immense in a way the adults weren't when they stood at the sink. He seemed to occupy meaning. "Santa?" I whispered, because you whispered to preserve belief. He turned his head. For a second I felt seen in a way that made my chest unroll. Then he bent and reached into his sack and I saw the silhouette of wrapped packages.
He looked, in that slice of child logic, like a man doing the work that men like Santa do. There was no fear. There was the entire architecture of wonder. In the morning, my parents confirmed the structure of magic. There were presents under the tree, some of which bore the wrapping I'd seen in the man's hands. They explained that sometimes adults dress up to keep Santa secret, or that Santa has helpers, or that sometimes people choose to leave things by the window. All of it fit into the simple economy of a child's world. Some truths are too sharp, so adults dull them down. As I got older, the memory kept its soft edges. At school, there were other stories, kids whose parents didn't have enough, kids who didn't get a stocking. We traded tales to make sense of our small lives. Teachers said not to worry about things like that. It was, I thought, one of those warm memories that you keep in a jar. Then, years later, when the jar had no lid, and the world was a more complicated place, the story shifted.
I was maybe 9 when the building above us became a scene in the news that sat heavy in the conversation of our block. The apartment upstairs, thin curtains, overused radiator, a family who kept to themselves, had been the site of something terrible. People in the stairwell talked in lowered voices. The police came and went like seasons. My parents listened at the kitchen table in a way that made me know the event was not for my ears. But when adults try to hide a thing, children still find its shape. It turned out that the man seen on the fire escape the night I was 4 was not a person making magic. He had been part of a violent incident upstairs. The man who'd bled into that hallway, bleeding is a blunt and terrible word, I repeat it because it's important to the way memory works, had been involved in a fight that escalated into something criminal and irreversible. The police found evidence. Neighbors were interviewed. Questions splashed our block like a cold wind. The specific details are not mine to sensationalize. What I remember is the way the picture changed. A comfort that had been a simple shape, rearranged into an outline of danger. The man on the fire escape was the same silhouette I had watched, but now I had the grown-up knowledge that he was soaked in someone else's violence. My parents' stories, of Santa helpers and costume-clad uncles, took on the look of a shield they raised to protect a child from too much truth at once. I asked them later, in the sort of bluntness children have, was that man? And they told me in small, directed ways what I needed to know without leaving open space for my imagination to work too hard. They told me about police cones, about the sound of men arguing that gets louder than it should, about a neighbor who made bad choices. They told me in the same voice they used when they washed my cuts and kissed them. They told me the truth, but placed it behind lace.
That's the thing about those protective lies. Call them white lies, call them kindnesses. They preserve the shape of a childhood long enough for a child to grow into a person who can hold terrible things. My parents chose to keep the edge away from me because they feared the way that knowledge could hollow out a small heart. They let me keep my Santa. For a little while longer, the world was ordered and safe. But the world does not comply with that kind of arrangement forever. As I grew, the memory reasserted itself in unexpected moods. When I got older, teenager, then college-aged, the story would flicker into my head in moments of private silence. Late at night, by a radiator that reminded me of that building, I would think about the way costs get divided. My parents had bought me a few more hours of innocence, but the bill had to be paid at some point. The moment of payment for me was not an explosive reveal. It was a slow, clarifying ache that taught me how adults fold away danger from a child's view. The revelation that night did not make me distrust my parents' care. It made me appreciate how much labor went into holding a childhood whole, but it also made me learn to read the world with different eyes. I began to notice the small ways adults dressed up everyday choices as explanations that made life smoother. I learned to ask gently urgent questions. I learned that a child's picture of safety is a fragile object, and that sometimes you have to carry it yourself when your parents can't. Time didn't heal all the particular edges. Memory rewrites itself. The man on the fire escape stayed in the background of other memories. Lesson plans, arguments, the first kiss that tasted like winter air, a hospital waiting room with stale coffee. I began to record the memory in my head with more detail. The exact angle of the metal bars, the way the porch light threw a ring on the bricks, the sound of my own breath when I watched him. Those details didn't make the incident less terrible. They only made me a more exact vessel of what happened. My parents built a gentle structure so I could be the child they wanted me to be. But at some point, scaffolding is removed, and the adult who remains has to stand on the ground they found. There's one late detail I want to wrap around this memory that shows how the world complicates our stories. Years later, when I told this story to a friend, they said, "You were lucky your parents kept that from you." It's fair to say that withholding pain is a kind of kindness, but there's also a cost. The revelation of the truth can be a betrayal that rewires how you interpret the world. You begin to doubt the shape of other kindnesses. You wonder what other edges your life has been smoothed around. That is not a bitter thought, it's a sober one. If there's a takeaway from this, it's neither condemnation nor praise. It is recognition of an honest human impulse, to keep children from knowing the worst for as long as possible. It's also a recognition that sometimes the worst comes to a window anyway. When that happens, the job of adults changes. They no longer only protect, they have to teach how to carry memory without being crushed by it. We'll leave the fire escape behind now and turn to a story that lives in a different register of fear, less about the hidden truth in a magical tale, more about the way violence can be used as language. Before I begin, another warning. The next story involves murder and the use of human remains as a message. It's upsetting. Proceed with caution. Story 4. A Skull for Christmas. The building in this story is not the same as mine. It is an apartment block in Marseille. Grade concrete, laundry lines, a courtyard that doubles as a neighborly market in ordinary months. People there learn to live with each other in a kind of practical intimacy. Keys left out, bread traded for a favor, small kindnesses stacked like bricks. Madame Basaka lived on the 3rd floor in a flat that smelled of cloves and boiled cassava, and she was known for the way she tended her plants on the fire escape like they were family. Her son had been missing for months before that Christmas. The worry had aged her, not dramatically, but like damp weather wears at a stone. She kept his chair pulled a little closer to the table and spoke his name into the hallway the way people pray out loud. The building's residents decided to do something to lift her spirits in small human ways. It started as a whisper. Someone suggested they all bring gifts. Then someone else offered to help wrap. And before long, the idea was a project people volunteered for with the sort of earnestness holiday projects inspire. On Christmas Eve, there was a small gathering. The corridor smelled of orange peels and incense. Voices folded into one another over a radio that hummed distant carols. They pooled money for a better chicken and set out a line of gifts on a table. Warm socks, a sweater, a jar of honey, a book in French with small notes pressed between its pages.
People laughed and sang and told stories about the boy they were trying to remember by cheering his mother. The next morning, when Madame Basaka reached for a carefully wrapped box with hands that trembled just enough to show the weight she carried, the building's small joy collapsed into a question of unimaginable horror. Inside the box, nestled in tissue and wrapping paper, was a human skull. With it, a small note, a present from your son. The handwriting was deliberate. The paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. The skull had been polished as if someone took time to make terror look tidy. I have to be careful here because words can become instruments of spectacle. There is a cruelty in those few objects that I cannot soften with metaphor. They were meant to perform a message, not to be part of an accident. They were intended to take a very private grief and set it on fire, to announce in the most obscene way possible that someone had power to break the boundary between mourning and humiliation. The building fell silent in a way that is not the absence of sound, but a suffocating pressure. Children upstairs cried. A neighbor loosed a curse. Someone went to fetch the police. People stared at one another, at the boxes on the table, at the contour for life that had been turned into a spectacle. The police arrived and did what they could. They sealed rooms and took statements. For the neighbors, it was not only a crime scene, but a moral wound. Someone had weaponized grief. The skull, a word that always makes the scene feel colder, was sent away for analysis. Neighbors whispered about gangs, about messages taken personally, about history in the city that carried its own scars. The police were careful with their words. They suggested it could be a gang signature, an act meant not to kill but to terrorize, to send a message through the most intimate interface, someone's sorrow. There are 1,000 ways to imagine why such an act might be carried out. People supply their worst explanations like a litany. But the uncomfortable fact in the middle of this is twofold. First, that the skull's presence reconfigured the building's sense of safety overnight. Second, that we don't need to invent motive to feel the harm. The skull did its job. It turned the holiday into a place of dread. Neighbors who had once shared sugar and soap began to move like people who had been reminded that proximity carries risk.
The woman who lived 2 apartments down stopped leaving her laundry out. A man who used to keep a potted geranium by the stairwell began to take it in at dusk. People looked at one another with a new read on faces. What else might someone be willing to do? The small kindness economy of the block. Gifts pooled for a chicken, shared candy on holidays, frayed at the edges. Madame Basaka unwrapped the rest of the presents like a person performing a ritual.
She sat down and thanked people with a voice that seemed to weigh each syllable as if balancing fragile plates. At one point, she picked up the little book the neighbors had found for her son and read the note inside, which people had written in the kind of generous shorthand you put into something you don't want to sound heavy. Her eyes filled. It's impossible to say whether that kind of communal love will heal a wound like the one inflicted, but it was an honest attempt. There are other consequences that ripple slower. For some neighbors, staying in the building after such a message felt impossible. My mother, the narrator's mother in this account, was not from Marseille originally. She had always been willing to lean into community life, but when a skull appears on your stair, it rearranges the calculus of risk. The day after the skull was found, she began to make calls. There were options: leave the city, stay and demand greater police presence, band together in a way that was not just social but defensive. She chose to leave. Moving is a hard decision, always. It is particularly heavy when it is motivated by an intangible terror that does not have a resolution. My mother's move was not a triumph over anything. It was a practical response. Find a place where the calendar is not punctuated by the sight of a neighbor's grief unmade into a spectacle. It felt like climbing out of a slowly filling boat. There was no vindication, only a small, exhausted desire for ordinary things: to keep the children safe, to breathe without the sense of being watched by a threat that had taken the language of home. In the weeks that followed, the building never quite recovered. People came to pray and then left. The story spread into the city and beyond. Journalists wrote colder versions of what neighbors felt. Some tried to make sense of motives, of gang markers, of regional tensions. The building's small economy of giving was layered over with speculation and pity. For the people who lived there, the bigger world's chatter did little to restore the private wound. There's a curious cruelty in acts like that skull. They are designed to be remembered because they're meant to unsettle. A skull is not just an object. It's a grammar of threat. It reads, "We can take your piece and return it to you in pieces." The specificity of the note, "a present from your son," is what makes it particularly sickening. It makes what was once a private love into public humiliation. It robs a family of the slowness of grief and performs it on a street for everybody to watch. Yet even in that act of desecration, the building's people performed their kind of resistance. They wrapped other gifts. They carried cooked food to Madame Basaka. Someone swept steps more carefully. The small routines persisted because communities do not vanish under terror. They adapt with the stubbornness of people who have to keep living.
They mourned and they organized in small ways, watching doorways, sharing phone numbers, asking for friends to come over and sit. That kind of neighborly solidarity is not dramatic. It does not make headlines. It does not erase trauma, but it can be the difference between a neighborhood folding under fear and one that reshapes itself around caution and care. My mother took that caution a step further when she moved. She traded the dignity of roots for a practical safety she could measure. People criticized that decision in different tones, but mostly, I think, they understood it. The act of relocating after a trauma is rarely framed as the right or the wrong move. It is framed as a human one. I want to be clear about something important. Violent messages like that skull are meant to dehumanize. They want people to feel small and naked in public. They want the receivers to be paralyzed by spectacle. The counter to that is not bravado. It is the slow, stubborn practice of showing up for one another, of refusing to let terror be the only voice dictating how people move in the streets. After the skull, the block's holiday lights got thinner. Some people left the decorations in the attic. Others kept them up with a quiet defiance. The city never checked off the box of explanation in a neat way. The police did what they could. The community did what it could. That is, often, how these things end. Not with finality, but with a rearrangement of practical lives. The 4 stories together. We began with a party meant to heal, and it was invaded not by a masked figure, but by the human version of entitlement, a man released by mistake who expected to reclaim what he'd lost. Then we went to a grotto where a woman's small, decisive courage kept children safe. We moved into a child's memory of Santa that shifted into an encounter with a violent man, and we ended with a neighborhood's offering turned into an instrument of terror. 4 Christmas scenes, each a different kind of fracture. If there's a thread that ties them, it's simple. The holidays soften us. Whether we give ourselves over to food, to faith, to lights, or to small rituals, we make assumptions about safety and continuity.
Bad actors, whether they be institutional errors, criminals exploiting costume, or gangs using symbols, find the seams. But the second thread is also clear. People respond. Friends hold someone down in a kitchen, a grandmother stands between a costume and a threat, parents tell a softer truth to protect a child, neighbors wrap presents even after the skull arrives. Those responses are messy and incomplete, but they're there. There are also institutional seams in each story. The clerical error that let a violent person out, the police who arrived after a grandmother held things together, the legal system that does not always line up with memory. We live inside systems that are at once protective and fallible.
Holidays magnify both the tenderness and the brittleness of those systems. What do you take from that? Maybe a small practical thing. Notice who around you looks like they need a check-in. Ask twice if someone says they're okay. If you have the means, consider small acts that shift risk. Accompany a friend to their car, keep an extra key to a neighbor's apartment if they need it during winter. Learn the number of local domestic violence resources. These are not grand solutions, and they do not fix systemic problems, but they do something that matters. They offer the practical warmth that systems sometimes fail to provide. If you needed to hear anything from these 4 stories, hear this. The season's lights are fragile. They don't need to be. People still carry those small, ordinary acts of courage: casseroles and dish towels, a hand on a banister, a neighbor wrapping a gift, through the darkest nights. Those acts don't erase the horror. They resist it, and that resistance is a form of hope. If this collection of stories reached you in a way that matters, there's one quick ask: subscribe and ring the bell to keep hearing these kinds of true feeling tales. If you have a story like this, something that happened at a time when the world was supposed to be safe, the submission link is in the description, and we'd love to listen. Before I sign off, one practical note: if any of these stories hit close, if you or someone you know is dealing with domestic violence, child-related trauma, or ongoing threats, reach out to local resources. If you're not sure where to start, consider your local shelter networks, local police for immediate danger, or national hotlines that can connect you to services. You don't have to carry the aftermath alone. Christmas is supposed to be small miracles and warm noises. It can also be a mirror. When it shows us ugliness, the real work is in how we respond, who we shelter, what we refuse to excuse, and how we keep small lights burning for those who need them most. That's the real spine-chilling truth. The holidays are fragile. They demand attention, not just decoration. Thank you for listening. If you want more stories like these, subscribe and consider supporting early access and bonus narrations through the membership link. If you have a story to share, something that belongs in this fragile, honest corner, send it my way. Take care of each other. Good night.